my name is Brett Ross. My project is improving patient outcomes in the ICU without using restraints. A little overview of where I'm going to take you guys throughout this presentation is just an introduction, some background information, the goal of the project, the methodologies, the implementations, what tools and study designs I'm going to use, evaluation, and finally a conclusion here. So going on into the next slide, the introduction. Pretty much, I was under the impression that, restraints are commonly used. We see them all the time in the clinical setting. But I didn't really have much experience with evaluating them. And I've always heard that they may be more harmful than beneficial. So I wanted to do more research on the idea or on the topic here. So what I found is obviously we see physical and chemical restraints used specifically with patients in the ICU. The most common application of restraints is said to be to protect the patients, from pulling out tubes or lines that are needed to keep their life sustained. But there's a lot of evidence out there and new research that is showing that there's a lot of negative effects or adverse effects or poor patient outcomes with restraint use. So the idea of this project was to see if they're actually beneficial or harmful. They're doing more harm than good. So just some supporting data or the evidence that's out there right now regarding restraint use in the ICU. What I found was that the higher the nurse to patient ratio, the more times restraints were applied. And there's also another statistic that 83% of restraints were applied during the night shift. I thought that was pretty interesting. And numerous sources, the three that are at the bottom are just three examples, but found that restraints are linked to complications like pressure injuries, delirium, PTSD. They even saw asphyxiation, sometimes even death, skin disorders, vascular disorders, pretty much what you would expect could go wrong with restraints. But that was all summarized there. There was a bunch of systematic reviews, but at the end of all of them, they say that there's more evidence or more research that needs to take place. So I thought that was interesting because there is data out there, but all of the studies and reviews say there needs to be more supporting data in order to implement something into practice. Obviously, we can make correlations, but what I read was that there's no causal or causal relationships between the two, set in stone through a study or a randomized control trial of that nature. So essentially this slide, I just wanted to point out that there's evidence out there that injury, both physical, emotional, are linked to restraint use in the ICU. So the objectives of this project, this is directly from my paper here. The aim of this project is to see if there's a reduction in negative patient outcomes with the use of physical restraints compared to those who are restrained over a 14-day period. So that was kind of the peacock question that I used throughout this term. So obviously that's the aim of my project there. The specific ways to measure it pertaining to SMART goals would be using the CAM ICU method for the ICU. This is just a way to assess delirium methodically and have it the same throughout. And then my other idea with the CAM ICU method was just an hourly physical assessment of the patient with restraint. And then obviously using the CAM ICU and physical assessment data that is found for those patients would require proper documentation. I talked about in my paper that because I mentioned that needs to be more research, that my project objective, this is kind of tying into the next slide, I'm getting ahead of myself, is hypothetical in nature because there needs to be more research. My idea for this project was to do a randomized control trial. That's what all the studies had suggested that they would be kind of like the gold standard for this topic. So the study design would have two a randomized controlled trial with 2 groups, which would be restrained patients versus patients with a 24-hour sitter. So the intervention group would be the sitter patients, and the control group would be restrained patients. With the inclusion criteria of being older than 60, you're eligible for restraint use, meaning a doctor would normally provide an order for restraints for you. And you're a proponent for long-term mechanical ventilation, because these are the patients that are most frequently put into restraints. And then, as I mentioned, with the objective using the CAM-ICU and proper documentation and physical assessment, that's how the data would be collected. So kind of using the Iowa model for the study design. I like this one because it's pretty structured, it's straightforward. You know, just looking here, you identify the issue. Is it a priority? Yes, this is a priority because patients are, showing evidence that there's harm to physical restraint. So we're going to form a team. Essentially what I'm doing here, hypothetically, with this randomized control trial, I'm going to do the research, which I have done, section 2 of the paper, the background and rationale. And then we need to conduct research. Is there enough evidence? All the studies suggest that there isn't, and that there needs to be more studies done, which is why I kind of went with that hypothetical randomized control trial. So hypothetically, the research would show me that yes, sitters do help reduce the amount of negative effects or adverse effects with restraint use. So then the Iowa model gives you a way to integrate the practice change. So I just kind of like it because it's simple. You can follow these steps, and I thought it would apply well with my topic. So yeah, it's slightly redundant, but the implementation of 24-hour sitters instead of restraints. This kind of aligns with, we've been told to use the least invasive, least restrictive method. So obviously, having someone watch you instead of actually being restrained is the least restrictive. So it's evidence-based there. We obviously know that is better for patient outcomes. So why are we doing it? Is essentially the question of this project. So the plan for my hypothetical study would be to have an on-call sitter system. Through my clinical experience, I've noticed, different departments are interprofessional care in the hospital. We're calling phlebotomists, we're calling lab technicians, x-ray techs, CT people all the time. So the idea would be just to have like a pool of sitters in the hospital, a set amount each day has to be there at the hospital. And if a sitter is needed for a patient that would normally require restraints, they would be paged and then do the sitting and observe and report to the nurse. Some common barriers that are pretty obvious were obviously staffing these people would take money, training these people would take time and money. And then you would need to have like a uniform documentation system for these individuals to give us data to show that negative effects are actually decreasing without restraint use. This also prompted the idea to me that we could use or third-party businesses would hire their own employees, staff them, train them, and then the hospital would just kind of call them if they were low on staff. That's kind of just like a pool. So the idea with that, there always has to be sitters available, so that's a challenge, but it makes sense to me because one, it's improving patient outcomes. Another stat in my research was that restrained patients typically lead to longer hospital stays. So if we're shortening hospital stays by reducing adverse effects, this would, save the hospital money, and we could reallocate some funds in order to compensate for the sitters that need to be hired. And then going back to the Iowa model, if this didn't work, a new plan would be implemented, more research would be done, and then the whole process would be carried out again. But pending, and the hypothetical project proposal would be that this research is backed up, and then this is how we would implement it. Ways to evaluate this would be comparing the data that is gathered through the sitters and through the nurses that are assigned to these patients using the CAM ICU, the physical assessment documentation that would be set up. And ultimately, we compare the rates of delirium, skin breakdown, pressure injuries, agitation, PTSD, and so forth, using past data and the data that we find using this method through this project proposal. Any ethical considerations would most likely be regarding data collection from the patients, but this really doesn't include any personal information or things of that nature. So just letting them know if it would be all right if we use their age and just if their status has improved or not, really would all we would need for consent. And obviously there's no identification data for a 6-year-old male who has improved outcomes without restraint use. There's really nothing that could be shared to hurt somebody. So other ethical considerations that were mentioned through this project were just the research I found showed that nurses, didn't really like employing restraints. So this method would also alleviate that and, give patients more quality of life, freedom of choice, whatever. Obviously, they're most likely sedated, but the studies show that even sedated patients come out with more agitation and delirium and PTSD, even if they weren't aware of being restrained in the moment. Expected outcomes for this proposal would obviously be reduced incidence of delirium, pressure injuries, PTSD, and other restraint-related complications. Improved patient outcomes, saving the hospital money, reducing length of stay. I mentioned it reduces the nurse's distress, and it could potentially help the financial benefits for the hospital and patients. Conclusion, I think I've highlighted that there is evidence out there to support that restraint use does cause adverse effects. There is much research that needs to be done in order to actually implement something other than my hypothetical study design here. But this is one way of researching, implementing, evaluating, and then going through the process again if it's not working. So ultimately, in conclusion, the last thing I'll say here is a shift away from restraints can significantly improve patient outcomes and healthcare quality. So thank you for listening.